Well, hello, Thrivers. Welcome to another day of Thrive Bible Devotions. Today, we are hitting a subject that is interesting and fascinating. One I was not excited to get to, but after reading it and going over it several times, I'm really actually kind of excited about it. So buckle up. Question comes down to, do women need to cover their heads when they preach and when they pray? And what a good question that is. Let's get going. 1 Corinthians chapter number 11. If you recall, man, we've been going through this book, and many people look here at 11 as being a transition from kind of Paul answering some questions to now Paul talking about order in the church. And I kind of disagree with this. I think the beginning of chapter 11 here, the first 16 verses, is either answering another question people had regarding coverings for women, or it's a transition. And we're going to give you some knowledge here, some truth before we start getting into order, or it's a combination of the two. That's kind of what I think. But almost every commentary, everything you read is going to say, or every outline, I guess, of Corinthians you're going to look at will mark this as a new beginning. But I disagree. Let's get to it. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 16. Paul says here, "Now I commend you because you remember me and you know what? Hold on. Time out. I forgot the first verse. And reason why is that first verse really belonged in the last video, and I really kind of messed that up. I didn't include that. Where Paul says, "Be imitators of me as I am of Christ." Now we get into this. "Now I commend you," verse 2, "because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions, even as I deliver them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. Since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made for man, so man is now born of woman. And all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For her hair is given not to her for her hair, the back half of 15. For her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God." All right, wow. That is quite the passage. There's a lot there to unpack. I hate that phrase, but there is. I don't think this is a new section. I mean, yes, I don't think it's a major new section in this book. I think Paul is transitioning because we're going to see in the last half of this chapter where Paul starts addressing kind of order, the way things should be in church services, right? But he's not mentioning in the church here anywhere. Nowhere in here. So, really, what is it looking like, right? I mean, and I guess that's kind of where we're going to go on this. I'll tell you, people have been debating this issue for a long time. People have all kinds of weird ideas. There's a person on YouTube I saw that had a 6 hour and 45-minute video on this subject, on these verses right here. 6 hours and 45 minutes. Guys, we're going to do this in about 15, all right? So I hope, Lord willing. So let's talk about this, okay? First off, this section does not begin a new section, but it wraps up the previous, right? And is used as a transition. Maybe both. Chapter 7, verse 1, and by the way, I'm talking about chapter 7 through this section here, okay? Chapter 7, verse 1 through 11, verse 16. In verse 7, chapter 1, he says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, right? And he talked about marriage and food, and I think he's talking about coverings. All right, so he introduces this section here. He says, listen, um, he basically, he's going to speak the truth to them in love, right? He says, I commend you, right? You're practicing the traditions that we taught you. And he's specifically talking about this head covering thing is a tradition that Paul had taught them while they were in Corinth. And he says, I commend you that you continue practicing this. It's good. He says, but I also want you to understand why we have these traditions, why this tradition is here. And then he's going to get into a whole conversation about headship, about kind of the order of authority in the world, and so that's what he's talking about. The coverings here is a tradition that illustrated headship, right? Who's the head over who, right? And he begins by saying, listen, the head of every man is Christ. Every man. The head of every woman, right? Or wife, as this passage translated it. And I think it should have been translated woman. The word is woman, but that same word can be used as wife. So maybe it is a good translation. I think it's obvious it's a wife, not a woman here. It's not saying every woman needs to be, every man is the head of every woman. That's not what it's saying. It's talking about that marriage relationship. But head of every wife is a man or the husband, and the head of Christ is God's. He's basically laying out, hey, listen, God is built into the universe, right? This hierarchy, right? God, Christ, man, woman, or husband, wife, rather, I think is the better way. Children, right? I mean, it's all those things are here. And he's basically saying, listen, covering is a tradition that illustrates this headship. He says, men who pray and prophesy, covered, with their heads covered, it dishonors their head. And I think he's talking about headship, right? Dishonors Christ. Women who pray and prophesy uncovered dishonors their husband, their head or husband. There's a difference between men and women, right? They are not the same. No matter how much society wants to say they're the same, they are not. Nor do they have the same role. All right? Men and women are different, guys. Probably get banned from YouTube for this one already, but so be it. We're trying to teach the Word of God and try to teach it honestly. Now he's going to give some arguments here. First off, he says, hey, basically saying society agrees with these differences. And they did in their society, right? Verse 5, they have second half of verse 5 and all of verse 6. Let's read it, shall we? You like the sound effects there? He says here, he says, since it is the same, if a woman, dishonors or has her head uncovered, right? For it is the same as if her head were shaven. So, for if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short, since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off. I'm sorry, this is where I'm going to start. I apologize. For it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head. Let her cover her head. It is basically making it clear that in society, right, it's a shame for a woman to cut her hair short or shave her head. And that's, why? Because, society doesn't agree with it. It's disgraceful for a woman to cut off her hair or shave her head. And it's just disgraceful is the way it says it. So the society is already showing an agreement with this. But then he says, listen, God created the differences, right? He says man is the image of God, and and woman is the glory of man. He basically is saying, hey, there's a difference here, right? And now listen, look here. He says now, women came from man, and man came from God. And he's taking the illustration out of Genesis where it says that, God created man from the dust of the ground. And then when God created woman, he took the rib out of man and made woman. She literally comes from man. And that's the illustration he's giving here, right? Listen, there's a hierarchy going on, right? God could have created woman from the dust of the earth, right? Couldn't he? But no, he chose to do it out of man. And it's a picture, guys. But I want now listen, people look at Joel, man, you know what? But that's abusive, man. That is to say that a husband is the head of the wife. Man, how does that play out? I mean, let's be real here, right? In a godly relationship, the man and the woman, they're together, right? They're praying and they're talking to each other. They take into account each other, when making decisions. But oftentimes there's times where they just don't quite agree, or they don't come to the same conclusion. And he's basically saying, listen, man is the one in authority there, and the woman is subject to that. Just as, right, there's lots of things that men want to do that disagree with God and disagree with Christ, even Christian men. And what do we have to do though? We have to submit to our authority, right? It's all about submission to authority here. Now listen though, look here, it says, however, we are not independent of each other. We both come from one another. Right? The woman was taken from man's rib, but then it says, but listen, men are born through the woman, right? It takes a woman to make a man child. And so they're both connected, right? They're both from each other. They're not independent of one another. They're interdependent of each other. And that's the way that relationship should be, right? They're interdependent. However, there is an order, right? There is a headship there where man is a head, has a head position over the wife, whereas Christ has a head position over the man. It's the way God has designed it. But everything is from God. And so we need to understand that. He then goes on to talk about how, listen, nature teaches that there's differences, right? He's like, hey, if men have long hair, it's a disgrace. If a woman has long hair, it's her glory. There's differences. Nature itself teaches this. And again, comparing hair to coverings, right? Coverings to hair. And then Paul goes on, judge for yourselves, guys, if this is a good tradition or not, right? He says here, well, we won't get to that. We won't actually get it. If you don't like it, Paul's basically saying, if you don't like the tradition, we will go into because I live with the Bible. And he says here, he says, judge for yourselves, all right, period. Then he goes on, verse here 16, if anyone is inclined to be contentious, in other words, you don't agree with this, right? Paul says, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. He says, listen, if you don't like the tradition, you don't like this tradition, right? And that's what he's called in the beginning, a tradition. We have no other similar tradition, nor do any of the other churches that are out there, right? No one else is doing this differently. So, the question is, what do we do with this, right? Okay, we've got this. Paul's saying, listen, the tradition is to cover your hair. There's reasons for this tradition. It talks about headship. And really, that's the big lesson here. The big theological thing here is not coverings, it's headship. It's the order of authority. And as much as I hate it, I hate it. That's the wrong. As much as I hate talking about it, this is a truth from the Word of God. So, what do we take home? Well, first of all, understand that there are differences, right? And that these differences are ordained of God, right? Do not try to overstep your authority. Wives, don't try to overstep your husbands. Husbands, don't try to overstep Jesus. Pretty simple, right? By the way, I think another thing you can pull from this is evidence of this rejection of biblical authority is often seen in the way different genders wear their hair or the way they dress, right? It is a shame for a man to live like a woman and woman like a man. Paul has made that very clear in this passage, guys. And I think this is really fitting for our society today. There's distinctions that God has made, and we ought not be trying to change those distinctions. The other major thing we see here is that there's value in traditions, right? Paul begins by saying this is a tradition. He's explaining why this tradition is important. And basically says we don't have any other tradition that you could put in its place. There's no other church that's practicing a different tradition. It is cool these days. It may have always been cool to be anti-traditional, right? I'm contemporary. I go to a contemporary church. I go to a traditional church. Paul, traditions are good. Traditions in and of themselves are not bad. Do not go throwing away traditions just because they're traditional. Some traditions have meaning, and that meaning can be very important. Now, there's traditions out there that are just tradition for tradition's sake. It's not what I'm referring to. But listen, before you go getting rid of your traditions, right? Take a moment and think about it. Why is this tradition here? Why is this important? What can I glean from this tradition? And decide, you know what, is this tradition worth having or not? It's funny to watch a lot of churches these days starting to bring back some traditional elements. Contemporary churches bringing back traditional elements. And they're bringing them back because they're seeing there's value in those. All right, guys, I hope this was good for you. I hope this was encouraging or interesting. If nothing else, did I answer the question whether they should wear coverings or not? I think it's a tradition Paul was teaching, and I think that tradition, I think we have other things that do the same thing for that tradition, right? It's how we dress. It's how women dress versus how men dress. There is a difference, there is a distinction, and we ought to keep it that way. Hope that answers that. I hope you guys enjoyed it. We will be back again tomorrow as we continue in Romans, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.